a lot. And I am very pleased to welcome all of you and looking forward to the papers. They don't have a common theme since this is a best paper session, but I note that all of them are very relevant to conversations that are taking place, at least in the US and maybe also in Canada at this very time. So I guess I will introduce myself. I'm Eileen Appelbaum. I'm Rosebaught's co-author on many, many things, including the presentation she's going to give today. So that's why I'm chairing so that she can present. All right, let's see if I can see. Okay, so the first paper is by Gabrielle Pepin of WE Upjohn Institute. And she's going to talk about the effects of childcare subsidies on paid childcare participation and labor market outcomes. And we have only an hour. So if each of the presenters could talk for no more than 10 or 11 minutes, we can have a little conversation amongst ourselves at the end about the papers. Okay, take it away, Gabrielle.
Okay, and I apologize. I'm going to stop my video because I'm having some connectivity issues. So hopefully that will help. Let me pull up my slides. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thanks for coming to our session. My name is Gabrielle. I'm a postdoc at the Upjohn Institute, and today I'll be talking about the effects of the Child Independent Care Credit. Okay, so the Child Independent Care Credit, or as I refer to it as the Cdcc, is designed to help families pay for employment-related childcare expenses. Basically, taxpayers receive a credit that's a function of their income and how much they spend on childcare during the year. And it's available to working families with children younger than 13 years old. That said, until 2021, the credit was non-refundable. So families who have low incomes and don't have positive tax liability after other deductions didn't benefit. Nonetheless, about half of states supplement the federal Cdcc with their own state child care credits, and some of those are refundable. And the big caveat is that to receive this tax credit, each parent in the household has to be working, and that includes both spouses in a married household. So in my paper, I'm using some variation induced by the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, which was a part of the Bush tax cuts, and expanded the federal Cdcc in 2003. And interestingly, this increased benefits differentially across different states and family sizes, because those states with Cdcc benefits calculate their benefits as a percent of the federal credit. So for instance, in Colorado, they offer a credit that's worth 50% of the federal benefit. In addition, taxpayers with 2 or more children are eligible for twice as much in benefits as taxpayers with only 1 child. And so in the paper, I use this variation over time and across states and family sizes to estimate the effects of this tax benefit on paid childcare use and labor supply. And first, I'll just kind of give you a little bit of background on kind of the benefits that people can receive across the income distribution. So for this graph, what I'm doing is I'm accounting for the non-refundability of the tax credit and trying to figure out what is the maximum benefits that people can take home based on their income. I do this using the tax filing thresholds or the minimum adjusted gross income or AGI levels at which people start to have positive tax liability after taking the standard deduction and any personal exemptions. So this orange line is going to show you maximum benefits for taxpayers with 1 child as of 2002 before this expansion. As we would expect, those with less than $13,000 in income don't have any tax liability and don't receive any benefits. Benefits then increase and max out at around $600. And then they decrease so that those with about $30,000 or more in income can receive up to $480 in benefits each year. This dotted red line shows you that after the federal expansion in 2003, benefits now max out around $940 for those with around $20,000 in income. They decrease over a larger set of incomes so that those with $43,000 or more can get $600 in benefits. The schedules for taxpayers with 2 or more children are more generous, but otherwise similar. And so this graph implies that eligibility tends to increase with income. When I look at that using data from the March CPS, that's basically what I find. So these black bars represent years 2000 through 2002, and the white 2003 through 2005, so after the expansion. And sorry, it's small, but these graphs look at across different AGI bins, so 0 to 15,000, 15 to 25,000, et cetera. What proportion of households with kids under age 13, who in theory could qualify for this credit, are in fact eligible. And eligibility tends to increase with income, so that those with around 100,000 income, about 30% are eligible for the Cdcc. And this is pretty similar before and after the expansion. In the right graph, I'm using data from the IRS statistics of income tables to look at the proportion of expenditures that are allocated towards different income groups. Interestingly, over half of all federal Cdcc expenditures are going to households with 25 to 75,000 in AGI. Very little goes to very low income or very high income households. So what would we expect? How would taxpayers' behavior would we expect it to change given an increase in Cdcc generosity? Well, because this is a childcare subsidy, we would expect people to increase their childcare spending. In addition, I'm going to argue that Cdcc benefits increase people's wages net of their childcare costs. And because all parents have to work to receive benefits, we also would expect them to increase their work participation. Of course, there's less scope for labor supply incentive among low-income taxpayers who don't benefit under non-refundability. The intensive margin labor supply incentives of this tax credit are going to be a little more complicated and vary across the income distribution. Everyone's going to experience a positive income effect. And for those who are on the phase out region of the credit, where benefits decreases, income increases, they're also going to experience a positive substitution effect. And so we would expect those people to work less. But for those on the phase-in region where benefits increase with income, they're experiencing negative substitution effect. And so their intensive margin labor supply response is theoretically unclear and something we can look at empirically. So turning to kind of the empirical part of the paper, the main data that I'll be using come from the March CPS. And so these are just some baseline summary statistics from before the federal expansion across single mothers, single fathers, married mothers, and married fathers with children under the age of 13. A few things to note: people tend to be about 36 years old on average. They tend to have about 2 kids, and about 25% pay for childcare on an annual basis. Married fathers are the most attached to the labor force, followed by single fathers and single mothers. Married mothers are the least attached to the labor force despite relatively high education levels. And so kind of given these baseline differences, I'm going to look at outcomes separately across these groups. Today, I'll probably just focus on mothers. And I'll start by estimating this OLS model, where I'm regressing an indicator for annual paid childcare participation for a given household in a given demographic group, state, and year. On the inverse hyperbolic sign of the household's Cdcc benefits. For those who might not be familiar, the inverse hyperbolic sign is similar to a log function, but it allows for. And I'm going to calculate these benefits using the data from the March CPS, along with some expenditure information from the SIP, and I detail that in the paper. I'll have demographic groups, state, and year fixed effects, where demographic groups are defined by number of kids, whether the household has a child under the age of 6, and whether the mother or single father has a college degree. I'll control for some state characteristics like indicators for universal preschool and paid leave. I'll control for individual characteristics such as age and race, and epsilon's the error term, and throughout I'll be clustering standard errors at the state level. Now we might think that this OLS model is biased for a couple of reasons. First, there might be characteristics of taxpayers that are correlated with both Cdcc benefits and paid childcare use. The example used here is income. Income is used to calculate your Cdcc benefit and is highly correlated with paid childcare participation. Additionally, changes in tax policy could lead to changes in taxpayers' behavior in a way that's correlated with their benefits. So if the CDCC expands, more people pay for childcare, that affects their benefits, that would make our estimates inconsistent. So I'll use an IV approach and create an instrument in the following way. I'll start with a set of taxpayers who reported their income and paid childcare use for tax year 2002, which was before the expansion. I'll replicate this sample of taxpayers for each year in my sample, which runs from 2000 through 2008. After adjusting for inflation, I'll use MBR's taxim to calculate the CDCC benefits that each of these taxpayers would have received in that given tax year, and I'll average benefits across states, years, and demographic groups. By averaging across these groups, I'm less worried about individual level unobservables that could be correlated with both CDCC benefits and outcomes. And by using taxpayers from before the federal expansion, I'm less worried about any behavioral responses to tax code changes. And so quickly, I'll just kind of give you a highlight of the results that I find. So for single mothers, the OLS estimate is implying that a 10% increase in paid childcare use is associated with a 1 percentage point increase, or sorry, a 10% increase in benefits is associated with a 1 percentage point increase in annual paid childcare use. For the IV, my first stage is pretty strong with an F-stat around 30. And the second stage is really similar to the OLS, where a 10% increase in benefits increases paid childcare use by about 5%. For married households, the results are actually quite similar. Again, I'm finding that a 10% increase in annual or in benefits is associated with about a 1 percentage point increase in paid childcare use. In terms of labor market outcomes, I'm not finding a lot for single mothers who tend to have incomes too low to be eligible for this tax credit. The estimates are pretty small and statistically insignificant. But for married mothers, I'm finding that a 10% increase in benefits increases annual employment by about 6%, hours worked per week by about 0.8%, and annual earnings by about 5%. So just to conclude, despite really different policy contexts, the results that I find are consistent with effects that have been found in Europe and Canada. I find very different effects of the CDCC than the EITC. This is likely due to differences in program design, whereas the EITC is really made to benefit low-income taxpayers. While about 20% of parents qualify for benefits, an additional 4% of single mothers, 2% of single fathers, and 2% of married households will qualify if this tax credit were made permanently refundable. And I have other work on this topic. And that said, I'm finding pretty substantial earnings increases among married mothers who tend to have higher incomes. And so there could be pretty large investments to expanding the CDCC even among higher income taxpayers. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was terrific. Really got us through that presentation and did it in just the right amount of time. So thank you for that. Is the CDCC the same thing that Biden just used to turn into a child allowance? Or is that
no,
different?
So that is different. That's the child tax credit, though they are commonly confused.
Okay,
so
thank
this
you.
is really only for child care expenses.
Thanks very much. Okay, so our next paper is our paper that Rose is going to present.
I need to unmute. And
yeah, that would help.
I'm going to share my slide, hopefully. Share screen. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, let me.
But we also see your slides down the side. If you have a way of eliminating that.
Yeah, I will. I'm
great.
going to do that. Let me just go to this screen share and the full slide show. So I actually am going to put my timer on, so I go 10 minutes, and well, hopefully that'll happen. So Eileen and I have been studying private equity, the private equity business model for years, 10 years, I guess. And we, over the last several years, we've moved increasingly into looking at issues of financialization in healthcare. And the private equity model is a critical one to examine. I don't provide a lot in the presentation, so let me just say, for those of you who are not familiar with private equity firms create investment funds, and then they use those investment funds, which they actually put very little money in, to buy out companies and take them private using a lot of debt. And they put the debt on the company or on the organization, in this case, hospitals. And they do a number of things that financially undermine the organization before they are extracting wealth and trying to get out of their investment in about a 5-year period. So that's the classic business model. And I'm going to show you how it plays out in healthcare. So this is a matched case comparison of 2 hospitals where we're looking at the financial stability of the hospital systems and arguing that this difference in ownership matters. New ownership forms, private equity, are coming in and promising that they'll achieve better financial performance than nonprofit or for-profit systems. And this study argues that ownership matters. The private equity firms argue that they can they're more efficient, they can do things better, and they have financial expertise that they can apply to healthcare. We compare 2 systems with many similarities, but radically different ownership structures, missions, governance, and merger and acquisition strategies. And we compare the 2 strategies. The 2 hospital systems are Montefiore Health System in the Bronx and Caritas Christi in Boston. Both systems were nonprofit, religious-based systems serving low-income communities since the 1800s. Both face similar healthcare challenges, clearly with crises of funding nationally. In 2010, both fell under the Accountable Care Act, which introduced certain conditions, but there's been increasing competitive market pressures, declining Medicaid reimbursements, and also opportunities under the Affordable Care Act to become, more use preventative medicine or population health. Both were also similar in scale and scope, but Montefiore faced more difficult socioeconomic conditions, and I just have a slide here to show you that. You see that this is Boston area Caritas, this is the Bronx, and both of them have high levels of uninsured patients, median household income that's low, people under the poverty rate, but clearly Montefiore was faced a worse condition. Then we want to look at how they diverged. So Caritas became private equity owned in 2010. And it was renamed Steward. So here's a side-by-side comparison of what happened. So the ownership in Montefiore remained nonprofit, whereas Steward became private equity owned. The mission changed in Steward. So here Montefiore continued to really focus on healthcare for low-income communities. But here, Steward adopted more of a financial model. It's like, how do we extract outsized returns for our investors, because they promise outsized returns larger than the stock market, and they need to exit in a short period of time. The governance and board composition changed at Steward. Here in Montefiore, almost all of the board members were medical professionals, so they knew the industry, plus they had financial experts, but they were looking at how to improve healthcare, develop population management. Here, they're all private equity partners and finance experts, and there was only one physician on the board who was also the CEO of the system. Then in terms of their expansion in mergers and acquisitions, most hospital systems are trying to grow and expand and merge other hospitals in them so they have a larger revenue base. So that's across the board. But Montefiore did it by establishing a regional system, whereas Steward did it through a national corporation. And then if you look at the goals of mergers and acquisitions for Montefiore was to create an integrated healthcare system with specialized units in community hospitals as feeders. So you can imagine the hospital system grows. This is a medical center. They're going to use their feeders to increase the span while also developing specialized units where they can allocate resources more efficiently. But in the case of Steward, they just kind of grew helter-skelter. They just bought up whatever financial deal they could across the country to increase their size and market power from a financial standpoint, not from a healthcare delivery standpoint. The pace of M&A at Montefiore was slow and steady, so they could then balance debt and equity and finance their expansion. But in Steward, it was extremely aggressive. Within 3 years, they expanded, as you'll see in the next slide, to 9 states. And they also used heavy debt, and they took all of the hospital property in their existing system and sold it to a real estate firm, and took that money and gave it to themselves back as dividends, 500 million in dividends, as well as then using it for this expansion strategy. So what do we find? Well, what are the financial results? Here, we see that at Montefiore, they had similar operating revenue. They had radically different net assets, right? And the net income, Steward goes radically into the red, where Montefiore is stable and growing. The margin here is 2.75, which for hospitals is good, negative 4.10, 4.1% for Steward. The operating margin similar, and the equity financing ratio, that is the ratio of the measure of how much debt is in your system. And here you see Steward is really financially in the red, which means that all of its hospitals are, are suffering under this burden and are financially unstable. If we look at, so the punchline is the private equity destroyed Steward's financial stability. And I don't have slides on, I'm surprised, I thought I had slides on size, but the systems ended up being roughly the same size, but Steward was larger and spread all over the place, whereas Montefiore was very regionally focused. And the healthcare quality in Steward by several measures was also quite lower in terms of quality of care. So what's the punchline? The private equity shifts the primary goal from serving patients to extracting wealth for outsized returns in a short time frame. The leveraged debt and property sell-off undermines the financial stability of the hospital, as well as employment stability and patient care. Steward closed some of its hospitals. And then what policy remedies? Well, there is a lot of talk about what can be done. And Elizabeth Warren, in her Stop Wall Street Looting Act, has a number of policies that would rein in some of the worst policies of private equity, such as using excessive debt and extracting wealth and paying themselves dividends in the short term, as well as requiring a compliance with the Warren Act and taxing private equity income more like regular income, and now they get away with the tax loophole. So that's a very brief overview. We have a paper that if people are interested, I'd be glad to share. And I am stopping there.
Oh my, this is the easiest chairing job I've ever had. Everybody speaks for just 10 minutes. Okay, so next up is Martin St-Arnaud and Pier-Luc. I can't read my own handwriting
It's
here.
Bilodeau.
Bilodeau, sorry about that.
No problem.
Why don't you guys take it away?
Yeah, thanks. I will be the presenter here. This is a study that was conducted by my student Martin under my supervision. I'll just share my screen. and I'll try to be as disciplined as the colleagues in keeping time. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so back in 2011, the province of Quebec became the only jurisdiction in North America to ban union hiring halls in the construction industry, replacing it by a web-based labor referral system, which seemed at the time to be, which was presented at the time to be sort of a panacea, as it was a technological innovation. So a couple of years ago, we wanted to study the performance of this new system. So just to be quick, I'll be covering what led to Bill 33, the change of system. I'll be covering the methods that we used, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we went from hiring halls to the what we call in French the carnet de référence, which is the new system, and then how we test the hypothesis that we draft and the results. So some elements of context, some of you might know that construction is a little different from other private sector industries. It's characterized by seasonality and cyclicality of activity, the temporary nature of projects and jobs. So job is largely casual in construction. The occupational structure in construction is largely trade-based, and there's a very large number of very small employers, and it might be even more the case in Quebec than in the rest of Canada and in the US. In Quebec, we have the same international unions that you have in the US, the AFL-CIO affiliated ones. They were created back, the locals were created back in the 1880s, but for a large part of the province, we had Catholic unions representing construction workers for most of the 20th century. These labor organizations still exist today. The conflicts over union membership, trade jurisdiction, and labor mobility led to a unique labor relations regime back in the 60s, which is an kind of an exception in the North American context because it's inspired for a large part from labor law in Europe. We have mandatory union membership for all construction workers in Quebec. They enforce union pluralism, so every single worker is allowed to choose his or her affiliation. There is provincial multi-trade sector-based collective bargaining, and the collective bargaining agreements are enforced in part by tripartite, quasi-public organization, which we call the Construction Commission of Quebec. Union hiring halls has been a long-standing problem for construction in Quebec. We banned closed shop back in the 60s when we adopted the new labor relations regime to ensure that plural unionism would be possible, and we replaced it by mandatory membership to one of the then 2, now 5 state-recognized labor organizations. The use of hiring halls has been used after the ban on closed shop as a tool for inter-union competition. And it was a central topic of 2 public inquiries in Quebec, one after the James Bay Dam events in the 70s, and one more recently after the Gaspésia paper mill events in 2004. The proposed regulation over the year about hiring halls have never been enforced properly, and more recent subsections of the R20 Act, which is the labor relations regime for construction, were deemed by many, including the Employers Association and the government, to be insufficient. So in 2011, the provincial parliament of the province of Quebec adopted a bill prohibiting union hiring halls. There were three main goals in the act that was adopted. One, to ensure plural unionism by preventing discrimination based on union membership. Two, to protect contractors' right to manage in the hiring process. And three, to offer an efficient labor market intermediary to substitute for union hiring halls. It's about this replacement that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. To study this new labor market intermediary, we used a program evaluation approach proposed by Paulson and Tilly, which is called Realist evaluation. And it was interesting for us because instead of looking at simply if it worked or not, they asked the questions, what works for whom, under what circumstances, and why. So we can end up having more nuanced answers in terms of policy development. It seemed more interesting. The goal is to come up with what they call CMO configurations, and to find the mechanisms that produce the outcome that the legislator or the public officials are looking for, given the many contexts in which the policies can be put into place. The interviewees, as we can see, as we will see, it's the research is based on qualitative data. The interviewees are seen as experts in the testing and refinement of the hypotheses. The case study that we used is in the civil engineering and road building subsector of the industry. Union hiring halls were most active in the industrial construction sector, but the topic was so hotly debated and was a topic of conflict so important for those unions and the employers that we chose to do the study in another subsector. To have more peace and quiet interviews and being less influenced by the political debates around the new system. We did interviews with two types of end users, labor representatives. So we did 8 semi-structured interviews. It covers all labor associations in Quebec, and 11 interviews with contractors. We wanted to do a survey research with workers and the interviews with the Construction Commission, which was impossible because the Construction Commission decided that it didn't want to participate in the study, being about too sensitive political issue. And the only way to get to the workers would have been through the unions, and there was some reliability issues there. So we chose not to. What existed before the adoption of Bill 33 was this kind of pattern in the relationships between contractors and workers. So the contractor could either go through traditional modes of recruitment, so hiring directly at the gate or through its own personal or company network. They could also use a database at the Construction Commission, which was almost never used because it was really poor in terms of information. And there was the union hiring halls used mostly for mechanical trades, so electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, boilermakers, structural iron workers, and so on. What changed is that they replaced the CCQ database with this new labor market intermediary, which is called the Carnet Référence Construction, through which the contractors and the unions must transact if they want to be able to get workers on a job site. So the unions are still in the system, but they need to get a permit to do the referral, and they have to go through everything. Have to go through the carnet de référence. There are no direct contact between contractors and unions, except in specific cases of emergencies. The 5 performance hypotheses from which we worked are as follows. First, by providing a list of candidates independent of union affiliation, the carnet offers an alternative source of workers to contractors, thus reducing their dependence on a specific union. So if the government or the legislator was to give back the right to manage to contractors, they had to give them some alternatives from the unions. So the new system offers one such alternative. The second hypothesis is that the system distributes all workforce requests to all permit holders in relevant trades. So an employer, contractor, would get not only 1, but 2, 3, or 4, or 5 lists of workers coming from different unions, thus again reducing the dependence on a specific union. 3, by limiting the scope of discussion between contractors and unions, and by making violations subject to heavy fines, the new regulation reduces the risk of intimidation and encroachment on contractors' right to manage. And then 4 and 5 is about transparency. The new system requires that an employer declare the exact number of workers needed for a job and the exact qualifications needed. In doing so, it is hoped that it will deter union from imposing more workers than the contractor actually need, or to impose workers that are not rightly qualified for the job. What we found based on our interviews is that basically the lists that are provided by the carnet, what we call the neutral list, are not reliable. The workers have to complete their own profile and keep it updated. So the information is often incomplete or inaccurate because the workers are not trained or motivated enough to keep them updated or fill in completely. So the list is unreliable. It's the same with the availability. The workers we found, based on what the contractors told us, the workers usually don't go back to the system to update their availability. One contractor even told us that he communicated once with the wife of a worker who had died recently. So the list is unreliable in terms of availability too. And the system doesn't allow workers to be specific about their qualification, making it difficult for contractors to make a choice based on the list. So as far as alternative is concerned, the independent or neutral list that the carnet provides isn't of much use to contractors. Regarding the second hypothesis, so the list coming from more than one unions, we found that some building trades in Quebec are in a de facto monopoly or quasi-monopoly, which make it very difficult or impossible for a contractor to get a list from more than one permit holding union. This is especially true in the situation of labor shortage, which is the case at the moment in Quebec. The fines included in the new regulation, they do have a deterrent effect on many union representatives, but not on all of them. Some of the ones that we interviewed didn't have any shame in telling us that they were violating the system nearly every week. And regarding the transparency of information, we found that the more traditional modes of recruitment were used as kind of a bypass in the system. So if they want an employer, if they can, impose more workers, they will simply do so by referring the good number of workers through the system, and then have the contractor hire 2 more through direct hiring. And we found that it was the case in many large projects going on at the time of the study in the province. In terms of the transparency regarding the qualifications needed by the contractor, the shortcomings of the system in terms of the information regarding the qualification leaves the contractor being the only real judge of the relevance of the referrals, making the control of prohibited practice more difficult for the construction commission. As you can see here, the same figure with a little change, that there's the arrows in red show that there's a bypassing bypassing loop, if you want, in the system.
Are you moving now to your conclusion?
Absolutely,
Oh,
yeah.
Perfect.
What can we learn from this? There are really 2 things here. One about union pluralism that isn't that much of a concern in the US right now. It's really more a Quebec thing. But more largely, what we did was be able to confirm past research regarding labor markets intermediaries. We confirmed previous findings about membership base, like union hiring halls, and job sites type labor market intermediaries. In the specific case of constructions, as far as the mechanical trades are concerned, we found that LMI, such as a web-based information system as a carnet, wasn't really the type of things that could replace union hiring halls to the satisfaction of the contractors. And also, given the temporary and transitional nature of construction projects, timing is such an important issue that the availability information is critical. So again, such a web-based platform was all the rage at the time, and it seemed evident at the time that was the obvious choice to replace union hiring halls. But looking at this from a neutral, objective stance, we can conclude that it's not the right LMI at all. So I guess that would conclude the short presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you
I'm
very much.
sorry for my bad English.
Well, your English was perfect. So, okay, if we can get back to the, stop sharing the screen and let us get back to the chat so I can, thanks. All righty. So the last paper is, okay, well, is Sarah Taglavi Soroui at Brandeis and Douglas Soorian Nevin also at Brandeis. And they're talking about placeless workforce development. So let me hand it off to you.
Yeah, and thanks everyone. Before we get into our presentation, I just want to provide a little bit of context that'll be relevant for the work that we're presenting today. I'm a research affiliate with Brandeis, and I also work full-time as a policy researcher with the City of Boston's Office of Workforce Development. So I'm here with my colleague, Doug Nevins, who is a master's in public policy at Brandeis, and we'll be presenting some data that exemplifies, I think, how the pandemic is changing the local workforce development system, and also provide a brief overview of one of our working papers about the implications of these changes for the sector. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Doug.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I'll begin by sort of discussing our research objectives and what the research is based on so far. So for the past year, We've collected data through interviews and surveys of workforce development provider organizations in the Boston area, looking at how the COVID pandemic is impacting the sector. And today we're presenting a preliminary draft of our paper, sort of exploring the changes as they've occurred throughout the pandemic period, and sort of thinking about remote service provision and how that will impact the sector going forward. So our objectives are to talk about how the pandemic has, we think, permanently altered the workforce development landscape, particularly with respect to the delivery of services and training in a remote operating context. We are discussing the possibilities created by remote workforce development programs, and looking at the sort of place-based and highly localized structure of workforce development policy and governance, and how that might limit some of the possibilities sort of created by remote service delivery. So our research began last summer. Funders in the Boston area, including the city, were interested in understanding what the experience had been for community-based nonprofit occupational training providers in transitioning services online. So we conducted in-depth interviews with 16 organizations, and then the Office of Workforce Development in the city has since completed a survey of community-based workforce development providers to see how their thinking and planning is going in terms of thinking about remote or hybrid services. So to provide a little bit of context, distance and hybrid models were not widespread in this sector, particularly in the kind of community-based occupational training space. Before the pandemic, the Employment and Training Administration has investigated the issue of technology-based learning, and there are a few reports from the past decade or so looking at the use of technology, digital technology and remote programming within provider organizations and within American job centers. In 2013, about 24% of providers had some type of hybrid services, and only about 1% were doing kind of complete distance learning programs. And as you might imagine, cost is a significant barrier, digital skills gaps, and technology access for both program staff and clients. Those also have created obstacles in widespread adoption of digital platforms. We also have found that organizations in Boston that already had more of this infrastructure were doing sort of supplemental digital skills trainings rather than necessarily delivering the kind of core occupational skills training remotely, over the internet using sort of distance learning capacity. So during the pandemic period, organizations invested in new technology. Implementation was very ad hoc, as was staff training. Challenges arose related to technology access, and as I think many people experienced during this period, the home environment not always being conducive to work or participation in a training program. At the time that we conducted interviews last summer, organizations were really sort of transitioning from a contingency posture into a period where they expected to maintain kind of remote service delivery for a longer period of time. So they were beginning to recruit new cohorts of clients, thinking about how they would sort of adapt to a longer term remote operating environment. And that's sort of the focus of our research now, thinking about kind of the continued use of remote models in this sector. So there's a few potential benefits and challenges that we think will kind of continue to persist in delivering these services remotely. There are some potential reductions in expenses for clients in terms of flexibility and access to services as well, potentially reaching some new populations. And also the biggest thing we heard from program staff is that digital skills are sort of increasingly seen as a critical labor market competency, and they're really being integrated more into the training programs and curricula for these organizations. Challenges include things like social isolation, challenges with engagement, high attrition for some populations, difficulties of recruiting populations with lower digital literacy in this period, for example, and just generally the issue of the digital divide and inequities that exist there. And so in subsequent survey that has been done this spring of a large number of workforce development providers in Boston, clearly there's a trend towards hybrid and remote services continuing to be offered. So a pretty high percent say that they will continue potentially fully remote services, much more so a hybrid service in which there might be some in-person components or remote components, or the option between those. So this is clearly a huge shift for a sector that we found was, one could say, fairly low tech prior to this pandemic period, with many organizations still using a lot of paper processing and generally delivering skills and trainings in a very sort of place-based in-person format.
And the providers also identified a number of new operational and programmatic capabilities in connection with their sort of shift to remote and hybrid services. For example, many of their providers expressed an interest in expanding their traditional kind of catchment area to recruit new clients, or provide refresher course options for former clients. And from an organizational perspective, we also heard, and the survey also corroborated the idea of optimizing physical space. Existing space, restructuring offices and classrooms is another way of sort of capturing some of the cost savings of remote work and virtual service delivery, and potentially reinvesting that into sort of client-based services. Next slide. So based on the interviews and the survey, we extrapolated kind of 3 key affordances that remote or hybrid programming has for the workforce development system at large. And so the first is diversifying and expanding the pool of service providers in a given local area. The second is obviously reducing operational costs. And the third is expanding opportunities for continuing education, professional development, and skill maintenance. Next slide. And I want to focus on the diversifying the pool of service providers in particular, because it's a feature of distance learning that some observers see as holding key benefits for the sector, in that it supports a more flexible and efficient workforce development system. And this possibility of extending, the geographic boundaries of service delivery to include non-local training providers is one issue that the Boston, our office, our workforce development board in the Boston area has sort of been struggling with during the pandemic. Internally, the pandemic really led us, our workforce development board, to sort of reassess the geographical eligibility requirements for training providers. And while we recognize that distance learning offers new possibilities for, say, building relationships with MOOCs or potentially providers located in neighboring workforce development areas, really the uncertainty around the implications of a shift in policy has led our workforce development board, at least, to reaffirm a local preference for service providers. So it was really drawing on our observations, Doug and I, sort of during this time being embedded in the system, and also reflecting on this survey data that we had that really motivated us to think about other local barriers that could prevent boards, workforce development boards, from accepting one of these affordances of remote and hybrid programming, which is the entry of non-local remote service providers. Next slide. And it's really sort of the spatial and temporal sort of flexibility of distance learning that has led us to think about how these dynamics challenge the highly place-based and localized structure of the US workforce development system. And as part of our paper, what we do is outline sort of the place-based features of use, the place-based sort of structure of the workforce development system, such as sort of the evolution of national workforce policy to state and local governments over the last 20 years. The fact that workforce development is sort of intimately tied with economic development, even though in practice these sectors are often siloed. Local economic development activities constitute a source of funding for workforce development. For example, Boston's linkages initiatives, which really direct dividends of new development and growth to support training programs for disadvantaged populations. But the point is that the system tends to be highly place-based, localized, whereby training provision, job placement adheres to administrative boundaries. In the case of Boston, the city, right? City boundaries. So this feature of workforce development is actually one that's sort of long been criticized as misaligned with the realities of labor markets, which are not really constrained by the borders of local workforce investment areas. Next slide. And so it's based on how, based on how local and place-based workforce development systems are, the aim of our working paper was really to identify other local governance and institutional dynamics that could constrain the possibility of including other training, including training providers that are non-local, but that could deliver services to a given, in this case, to Boston. And so based on our literature review and sort of our own observations, we identified political barriers, some of which are unique to the education and workforce development system, others that are more general features of urban regimes and local politics. For example, workforce development systems have been sort of characterized as employment regimes, which kind of refers to a network of organizations that are more concerned about their own survival. In this environment, new entrants into the system are often thwarted. Other factors like sort of political capital that local elected officials might receive from channeling grant funds to local organizations are barriers that can make it more resistant, the system more resistant to expanding administrative boundaries beyond political boundaries. And we also identify other factors like poor regional coordination as another sort of significant issue. The absence of strong regional mechanisms could potentially hamper the establishment of an institutional framework that would be sort of necessary to support any kind of cross-jurisdictional training opportunities. And then finally, since workforce development is so closely tied to economic and community development, we consider the role of local nonprofits as mechanisms to support investment in the built environment and also the labor markets of distressed communities, which obviously could reinforce the sort of preference for channeling limited workforce development dollars to those local physical organizations. So this is, I guess I'll stop here in the interest of time, but we're planning to do a larger survey to help us sort of clarify how the post-pandemic service models will evolve. Also gather some more information about other constituencies that could be impacted by this shift and potentially other institutional barriers to the expansion of distance or hybrid learning in the sector.
Well, that's great. What a great panel we had. Everybody stuck to their time, and that leaves us with about a little more than 15 minutes for questions. So I'm not going to try to.
I think we end at 3:45. It's
really
just
well. In that case, we have no time for questions. I'll just ask whether anybody on the panel wanted to ask anybody else on the panel a question or make a comment.
I would just say that two things around Pier-Luc's presentation. I think of Quebec as being very progressive, strong unions, 40% unionized, and, the social economy is alive and well. And it, you were a little bit, you seem to be objective in your analysis, but it seemed to me that this was a tactic to undermine union power. And that, by trying to create these direct links through a remote service, that it's undermining union power while also doing these other informational things that you comment on. So the question, politically, who was behind this, and was it really an attempt or to undermine unions, or is this kind of unforeseen circumstances?
It was actually both. And I, for one, I opposed the bill, and I went to the news about this. I think it's an encroachment on freedom of association, but there were, real problem of discrimination on work sites, people affiliated, members of other unions not being able to work on major work sites in the province, being, physically prevented from entering the job site to be able to, do their hours and get their salary. So there are real problems there, but it was mostly, I think, an error. But it's a personal point of view. So it's partly, justified, I think, in terms of what kind of discriminations based on union affiliation that we had in the past. But it's also an attack somewhat on labor unions. But hiring practices doesn't affect collective bargaining as much in the kind of multi-employer system that we have in Quebec than what you might have in the States or what they have in the rest of Canada. because it's not trade based. It's always multi-trade. So it's not as much a problem in Quebec as it could be elsewhere.
Thanks.
So I have a question, Pier-Luc, for you coming from the other side. So AT&T has been invaded by a hedge fund who wants to get rid of unions wherever they can. And the union is powerless to stop this whole process, but they want to take techs and turn them into independent contractors. Of course, the best independent contractors and the ones with the experience will be the folks who previously worked for the union. They want as much of that work for their previous members, or maybe they have a way to hold on to the members if they can get the work for them. So in the exact opposite situation, where you have a company like AT&T and a union like CWA that never had any experience with a hiring hall and can't imagine how it would organize a hiring hall for these skilled technicians. Do you think this labor market intermediary app might be something they could look into?
The main problem that we saw with the app that was developed in construction in Quebec is that the information wasn't rich enough. So regarding those techs, which obviously have, you know, specialties and, you know, very precise qualifications for, in terms of technical skills, the kind of intermediary that we have in Quebec for construction wouldn't be able, you know, to really all the richness of the qualification of those workers. So it might be a handicap at some point for them.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I was just wondering because they're
Yeah.
desperately looking around for how they're going to handle this situation. Okay, so we don't want to monopolize it. Are there any last questions from anybody else in the audience or on the panel?
I'd have one for both of you, Eileen, actually, for Rose and you,
Sure.
if I may.
Yeah.
Hearing what you describe from those cases, I wonder, how does it affect you know, nurses and support personnel collective bargaining? We've had labor shortage in the health sector in Quebec and the rest of Canada for some time now, and it was fueled by the pandemic, obviously. And now the bargaining position of these occupations is stronger than it was, you know, 2 years ago. So how is it in those situations where you'd find, you know, a private equity owned health provider, which is in the red? How does it affect? Do you see a direct effect on collective bargaining, the wages and the hirings?
Well, it's uneven. There are some private equity firms that actually they don't care. They're willing to trade off. They're willing to deal with unions. And in fact, in one case, the private equity firm granted neutrality to unions to allow them to organize, but in return for basically the union backing off some other demands. So they're willing to bargain, but in other cases we see that you know, the unions have roundly gone after the private equity owned companies that tend to have lower staffing ratios. And so that's a particular problem. I don't think we have evidence that the collective bargaining, they haven't gone after wages per se. I don't think they can, given, as you say, the shortage of healthcare workers. We've seen it more in terms of staffing levels, I think. Eileen, what do you want to add to that?
No, just to say that these private equity owned hospital system, at least in Massachusetts, where it had its beginning, those hospitals were all unionized. So I think Rose is right. It's about staffing. It's about closing down particular service lines. They had those kinds of complaints. It was not really over
or shortages of supplies. So they're looking to cut costs. They can't really cut wages because of, you know, the supply issue, I think, but they cut costs in all sorts of ways. And so we have some rich case studies of where private equity firms or, you know, for-profits who use the same playbook come in and substantially undermine the quality of care.
Right. I agree.
Thanks.
Okay, other last questions or?
I'll just say that I thought the other papers were fabulous and
Yes.
really interesting, and it's too bad we don't have more time, but these Zoom sessions are only an hour long, and that's what we live with this year.
That's true. We can't hang around afterwards and just chit chat. So that is too bad. But I did find the papers really interesting. Would like to know more about how the Cdcc intersects with whatever Biden is doing. Sorry, we don't have time to discuss that. You know, the papers were all extremely interesting. The training paper, I'm curious to see if you keep on doing those surveys, what you learn over time as the pandemic fades into the background, hopefully. I'd be curious to see how that all works out. So this was a fabulous panel, interesting papers, and so happy to be part of it. Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Ellen, just hold on.